What's so special about recipes from the 60s? Well, let's set the record straight. These recipes didn't just keep up with the culinary shifts and trendy ingredients, they defined them, creating a menu so legendary, you'll wonder how you've survived this long without tasting their brilliance. The Amish Yum Yum Salad is pretty much a creamy and incredibly rich, sweet salad made entirely out of fruits. It has a lot of its influences in the culture of the Amish, specifically around some areas in Pennsylvania where the Dutch communities are very prominent. It's similar to a lot of other dishes that are made from these cuisines as well. It makes a lot of use of what's available, and the idea here is basically to be very resourceful. Naturally though, the context these recipes find themselves in means that they have to adapt to the broader palate and trends of American eating. They kind of lose their traditional essence along the way, something that most Amish people tend to not like. Amish cooking makes a lot of use of canned fruit, whipped cream, and custard, and this recipe takes all of them to make a very interesting salad. It was pretty typical to serve this gelatin salad during family dinners, and the 60s were a time for jelly-based meals anyway. Mushroom and leek salad is an old recipe that we can thank Europeans for. It's something that's always been really prominent in the many French, British, and Italian communities that are present in America. If you take a closer look at French culture, like a lot of Americans were doing during this point of the 20th century, you'll find that they've always played around with these two ingredients. The mushroom and leek salad in America doesn't exactly stick to any one kind of way of making the salad. It's got a little bit of everything, flavor, warmth, and a beautiful mixture of mushrooms that quenches what your heart craves. The French way is to emphasize the earthiness of the mushrooms, while the European way makes better use of the leek and dresses it up with vinegar and herbs. The Italian way sort of does both, and the American variant of the salad has regional differences depending on which area has more of which community. Ground pork pasta is a pretty comforting dish that got really popular in the South. You might be surprised to hear this, but this is actually another piece of Italian culture. Ground pork has always been at the forefront of Italian cooking in America. They put pork sausages in their bolognese and make several pastas out of it too. A lot of the Italian way of cooking heavily involves a focus on garlic, wine reductions, and lots of herbs so that a flavorful base can be made for the dish. Italian immigrants would, in specific, spread around their many treasured pasta-making secrets when they first came over. They aren't the only group in America to really notice how well ground beef goes with pasta, though. A lot of Asian communities note the combination for pretty much the same reason. It works really well together, and plenty of low-budget, comforting recipes have been around it. This was a big part of home cooking in the 60s, and it was a great way to make use of some canned meat. If you had any leftover beef from a casserole or meatloaf, you could repurpose that too. We're going to flip-flop between American ideas and French inspirations a lot in this list, so buckle up. Next up, we have beef Burgundy over noodles. This pretty much is ripped right out of the streets of Burgundy in France, and it's an offshoot of a classic and traditional French dish known as boeuf bourguignon. This was one of those high-end dishes you could order at upscale French restaurants meant to offer luxurious dining experiences. It wasn't really something you could make at home, but the taste was pretty irresistible. People definitely wanted more of it in their week-to-week eating plans, but they couldn't exactly keep up with the crater it was leaving in their wallets either. Well, one thing led to another, and a homemade version of it known as Burgundy over noodles came together. The dish used egg noodles instead of the traditional pastas that the French would use. It kept other things the same, such as using red wine to braise the beef. This recipe was common in cookbooks by Julia Child, who was also one of the few mainstream chefs who really vouched for this dish and tried to make it this nationwide hit. I think she pretty much achieved her goal there. You can find lots of references to this dish in cookbooks from the 60s, and I'm talking about the ones targeted at families like yours and mine. So the 60s wasn't just marked by us being nosy about other people and their long-standing food traditions. It was a time of culinary experimentation, if the gelatin salads didn't already make that clear for you. One of these Frankenstein-esque experiments was the Zucchini Hamburger Pie, which, yes, I know, that's a hard one to imagine. This pie is a quintessential mid-20th century banger, and it blends in the practicality of ingredients that typically make up a lot of grocery lists, like ground beef, and the variety that zucchini offers. The thing about zucchini is that it can work in a lot of different ways, which makes it really convenient. Funnily enough, that quality is exactly why it became as popular as it did during and right after the Second World War. This summer squash was suddenly one of the most cultivated crops around the nation, and its mild flavor made it a popular pick at most farmers markets. It had its biggest market in the suburbs of the 60s, where lots of home cooks, moms, and grandmas relied on zucchini harvests for their show-stopping dishes. This combination of beef and zucchini in the form of a pie was definitely one of those main players in their roster. And it's a dish that, despite losing its relevance over the years, really made waves for how it explored some new ground in both the way you use a hamburger patty and what you can do with pie. The concept of a dill mushroom turnover was pretty much taken from the trend of pastries with really sweet fillings. It's not really anything new, but it is one of those food traditions that disappears and resurfaces every other decade. You have counterparts for these in all cultures, but today we're talking about how dill mushroom turnovers became such a cultural moment in America. In Pennsylvania, which was pretty much widely known for its incredible mushroom farming potential, advancements in farming techniques meant that it was a golden age for mushroom lovers. Dills, on the other hand, were slowly becoming more and more popular thanks to all the European immigrants coming over. Then you had cocktail culture. A lot of people were going to cocktail parties that basically featured appetizers and one-bite dishes. There was a bigger focus on digestible, light food instead of hearty, grand, and massive plates that could feed a whole family. You take all three of those changes, and what do you get? Tortillas, and they're an amazing choice for an entree. Speaking of massive meals, chicken and wild rice casserole is a pretty good example. This is something that you typically see all over North America if you ever went, particularly in areas with a large Native American presence. It's because wild rice is such a big piece of their culture. It's known as manuman in Ojibwe, and it's pretty well known around the Great Lakes. Fun fact, they used to harvest wild rice by hand. Eventually, European settlers made it a mainstream part of people's diets, but that was in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were lots of reasons to be eating wild rice. It was nutritious, it was filling and affordable, and it worked really well with casseroles thanks to its inherently nutty notes. You have to understand one thing about the 60s and 50s as well. They were the first decades Americans had since the start of 1910 and the beginning and middle points of the 1920s. After that, it was just recession this, war that. People got really tired, and half the country was rediscovering their culinary spark, while the other half had sworn to pig out for the foreseeable future. And honestly, who could blame them? Surf and turf is a seafood and ground meat combination that really took the competition by storm in most coastal regions. It's not exactly a specific dish or recipe, but a style of dishes that have a massive focus on combining things like lobster and steak. Basically, if you're a meat lover of all kinds, this is the dish for you. Where did the surf and turf name come from then? This was pretty much just slang of the times. It was used to refer to bougie dining places and big events with their exotic catering needs. It was also supposed to represent the two core components of the dish. You had your seafood, the surf, and then you had your meats, the turf. Genius, I know. If you ever needed a knockout menu for a wedding or a big dinner, then you'd go for surf and turf places. So surf and turf isn't exactly its own genre of food either. It just refers to anything that puts seafood and red-white meat together. Lots of people think that the dish first came to life in North America, but a lot of people also think it was made in the West Coast. No one can really say who the first person was to do it. It was pretty common to serve this dish with comforting sides like asparagus and beans or mashed potatoes. A lot of places would use béarnaise sauces too. Louise's lasagna was this adaptable lasagna recipe that did a lot of substituting and took advantage of the trends of the decade. Remember how we talked about the way people were really opening up to zucchini, and also how farming mushrooms was easier than it ever was? While we aren't sure who the first Louise to do it was, we do know that there were loads of people who made amazing use of both of those facts, and this lasagna is just one more testament to that statement. It basically substitutes a lot of typical lasagna ingredients. Normally, most Americans use cottage cheese in their lasagna. This time around, the dish asks for ricotta. You normally don't really see many vegetables in lasagnas either, but this time around, zucchini and mushrooms make a wonderful appearance as the B team for this dish. As far as the meats go, that area is pretty much the same. Lots of places had their own versions of spice blends and sauces that they'd save for this recipe. But the idea was basically to reinvent lasagnas with the trends of the times. Spaghetti Diabel is pretty much a pasta dish that's known for not being forgiving. Some dishes tend to be approachable. You feel like they're inviting you to try them, and they look irresistible too. Not this Diabel, not in any way at all. It looks like your typical plate of pasta, although with a lot of warm colors, but it tastes like it's trying to hurt you. This spaghetti is known entirely for its devilish heat, which has sent more than a few people to the counter asking for a glass of milk. It's not really the chili that does it this time. It's the black pepper. This pasta dish is known entirely for how spicy it can get, but the American version is actually a lot tamer. If you were making the original, authentic Italian version of the dish, which some communities and restaurants did, you'd be tackling an entirely different beast. On top of the black pepper and chili, you also have red pepper flakes and cayenne pepper in the sauce. So yeah, don't try this if you wouldn't bet money on your spice tolerance. I know I'd lose that bet, so I steer a little clear from dishes like these. But spicy variations of typical dishes like spaghetti were actually getting more and more popular throughout the 60s. There was another trend that was pretty much unique to the middle of the 20th century, which was a turning point for a lot of things. Chicken salad pie was one of the examples of how America was really trying to take its commitment to healthy eating just a bit more seriously for once. You'll notice that every time the status quo tries to change to something else in America with regard to food, it always has to start off with something familiar. Like, for example, chicken salad pie does involve a salad, but it gives it to you in the form of a pie, which is infinitely familiar. Pineapples have to be served on pizza and with ham for them to be noticed. And even then, the discourse on whether or not it's food blasphemy never stops. This chilled salad was just as divisive, with a lot of people thinking that salads have no place in pies. Chicken salads have been around as early as the 20th century, though, and it doesn't seem like they have any intention of leaving. This pie was an everyday meal you could make and also use as an excuse to get just a few more greens into your family's diet, which is something Americans really could use a lot more of. On the other hand, you have chicken Parisian. This is a dish that makes a lot of use of French techniques to give you authentic American flavors with a new twist. Sautéed chicken, or baked, with a rich and vibrant sauce that makes use of white wine and mushrooms. Sounds pretty European already, aren't we? Are you a little curious as to why so much of this list has massive French influences? It's because that's the direction Americans wanted to take their diets in after the World War. The second one, at least, led to a lot of people exploring foreign cuisines. One of the most well-established ones was French cooking, and people really wanted to see more of that. There was a practical reason, too. People realized the importance of taking a page out of the books of others, because lots of cultures and cuisines were more resourceful with their food. Things like chicken Parisian were a fine example of how French techniques and recipes could take simple ingredients and make them into a wonderful main course. Americans typically needed a lot of dairy to do that, and that was something the public was trying to cut down on. Here's a trend that was really popular throughout the 1960s that we haven't talked much about. Guess again, carrots were a part of the entire movement surrounding glazed vegetables. I'll put it plainly, vegetables do not make for an exciting meal. I'm sorry, I know that sounds like it's a hill someone with the taste buds of a 12-year-old would die on, but it's just not the most exciting thing to order. That was mostly because a lot of vegetable recipes didn't go beyond ever baking them or using them as a side, though. Once people found new ways to incorporate vegetables into their diet, like glazing them, they realized how good they could be. Particularly turnips were really helpful in shattering this image. Glazed turnips were one of the most common Depression-era meals. Now the next thing, why the name Guess Again? It's because despite how you associate carrots with a slightly earthy and planty taste, this first bite is actually the opposite. It's really sweet, and it's packed with an amount of flavor you'd never associate with a carrot. It got really popular, not just as a side, but as a standalone veggie dish as well. If you really go into the trenches of rustic, southern cooking, you'll discover onion bowls. One thing about the wartime period was how much rationing was a thing throughout the country, and that basically meant that there was a void to fill. When the typical staple ingredients people were used to weren't available to them anymore, they had to make do with whatever was easy to grow. That meant a lot of potatoes and onions, but on their own, onions really didn't amount to all that. Onion boils, however, were a pretty nice and nifty little fix to that conundrum. These boils revolved around making your onions by placing them in a broth that had a lot of seasonings and sometimes other vegetables too. Home cooks thought it was a pretty inexpensive and frugal meal that helped stretch out your groceries just a bit more until the end of the month. A lot of people in the South also thought it made for a really good side dish too. I mean, after all, it is just onions in a broth with some seasonings. Home cooks would rely a lot on convenient food like this to pass the days, especially with more and more women taking up places in the workforce. This was a meal that even your kid could make for themselves easily. Poppy seed chicken was a byproduct of all the madness around casseroles that dominated so much of the 1960s. After the Second World War, there was such a big increase in the production and popularity of canned food. People couldn't deny the sheer value it had, and a lot of canned food meant that casseroles were easier than ever to make. The 1960s saw lots of creamy casserole recipes being raised to new heights. They were in the mainstream conversation, and they were at the dead center of it too. Casseroles would often use cream canned soups, like cream of chicken or cream of mushroom, for the base. These soups were really cheap, light, and easy to incorporate into lots of dishes. Poppy seeds, on the other hand, didn't really have much of a presence outside basic dishes like muffins and cakes, but they started to be used in savory dishes around this decade. It was a way to make your casserole look and taste just a bit better. For the chicken, you'd use boneless breasts, which was kind of another piece of evidence of how Americans were gravitating towards hassle-free food. The seeds would be mixed into the sauce, or you would use them as a garnish on top of the casserole, along with panko breadcrumbs. Some people in the South would really just use Ritz crackers, though. It was one of the best ways to satisfy that casserole itch, especially if you wanted a casserole that wasn't too new, but wasn't really familiar either. While exploring the many flavors and styles of the subcontinent has been a recent development, the seeds for it were being sown with recipes like chicken and collards Palao. This Southeast Asian dish was adapted in the southern parts of America, and while it was distinctly different from its authentic version in places like India, it was still a good attempt. Palao itself is something that isn't entirely exclusive to Southeast Asia, though it also has African influences. Both styles of this dish were used across the states, with the South typically leaning more towards the version brought by the African diaspora. The cooking techniques here really involved a lot of slow cooking. The rice was supposed to be set to oil alongside the broth, which was loaded with vegetables and chicken. You had your onions, garlic, paprika, and bell peppers, which was a bit of a deviation from the typical recipe, but Americans need to adapt things for their own palates. Some people called it soul food, some people thought it was Indian cuisine breaking into America, but a lot of people tried it, enough that it stayed as a part of many menus even today, and that's how you know you have a good dish on your hands. Another casserole that's really worth discussing is the old school squash casserole. This is just a Southern classic through and through. Yellow summer squash is the star of the show here after all. A little context if you'd listen. Yellow summer squash has been a native of many Southern gardens for decades and even centuries now. It was something that Native Americans first started cultivating, and it was a part of this trifecta they had known as the Three Sisters method of planting. Basically, they'd take this squash and plant it alongside beans and corn. The climate there made it ideal for it, and lots of recipes were born as a result of this squash. We already went over how easy it became to make casseroles thanks to all the canned food in grocery stores. But squash was one of the things you still needed to rely on farmers for. There were canned variants, but the dish would really shine if you got fresh squash from a local garden. Next, you have your eggs and cheddar or Parmesan cheese. Then, just a little bit of zucchini rounds the dish off, with breadcrumbs on the top for a bit of crunch and garnish. Luckily, this dish is pretty healthy too, so it passes most criteria people have for what should be a regular part of your diet. Sheet pan paprika chicken and veggies were a pretty explosive dish that got popular for a number of things. Everyone likes a team player, don't they? Something that suits a lot of people. This was exactly one of those things. You have here a dish that's easy to make since it uses basic vegetables, is a one-pan meal, and uses boneless breasts. Then you have something that basically has no skill ceiling. You don't need to be a pretty good cook or a sauté master to really make this work. Know how to roast? You're good to go. Then you need some basic seasonings like paprika, and everyone knows their way around potatoes and carrots. All together, you end up having a wonderfully simple dish that takes paprika and reminds people why it's such a top dog in the spice world. It's something that blends European influences alongside typical American seasonings and makes them work extremely well. And people honestly love it for that. This kind of meal worked really well with the way job culture was changing in America. People were finding themselves working longer shifts and more hours than ever before. One-pan meals where most ingredients were made well in one pan got really popular. Little meal prep, and you could often just make them in advance too. So one of the most memorable things to come out of the Great Depression and wartime cooking was the extreme focus on all kinds of stews. People were realizing more than ever before that a stew is the best way to have food for a few days and keep a family well fed. Mushrooms are already something we've discussed in extensive detail. The type of mushrooms that were getting popular isn't really something we went over though. Here, and in fact most of these dishes, a lot of people would use portobello mushrooms. Those were the most common ones next to button and cremini mushrooms, thanks to how rich they were in flavor. It's the same reason people love shiitake mushrooms in their hot pot and ramen. It's just one of the best ways to have a stew, and it works for the vegetarian crowd too. Some mushrooms, like lion's mane, actually have a really similar texture and flavor to meat. This helps them transition to a meat-free lifestyle. There are lots of pros about mushrooms. They're cheap, easy to handle, can work in a number of things, and have a lot of flavor. Stews are still one of the healthiest meals you can ever have, so mixing the two together was a solid favor that Americans did for themselves and their health. So we've never really delved into a lot of Russian cooking. Granted, there's not a lot to speak of, at least not in comparison to other regions. Still, one dish that's really worth talking about is ukham, Russian fish soup. This really changes region to region because the kind of fish that you can get for your catches of the day makes a different soup each time. Typically though, most traditional recipes call for a lot of perch, carp, and cod. These recipes all have one thing in common. They fillet the fish and cook it on the bone. Ukha is typically made in a clear broth alongside those fish, and the heads, tails, and bones really help to add flavor. The next layer in its profile comes from all the aromatics. You have carrots, onions, and parsley roots, as well as just a little bit of black peppercorns and dill. So far, we have a lot of ingredients that might be a little unfamiliar to you, but this one takes the cake. Have you ever heard of vodka with your soup? Me neither, but leave it to the Russians and the French to find a way to mix every kind of alcohol into food. Butternut squash was another kind that people really treasured thanks to all the sweetness it had, which you might have guessed from the name. This one's a lot older than yellow summer squash though. It's something that was also planted and cultivated by indigenous people and then later on appropriated by European settlers. While people are a little shaky on its history now that it's been so long, it still holds up just as well today as it did all those years ago. Butternut squash has a really special texture, which is a part of why it can still keep up. It's really creamy on top of being sweet, but not in a way that's overbearing. The perfect pairing for this was some homemade dumplings, which were becoming increasingly popular thanks to an increasing Chinese-American presence, both in the population and the restaurant scene. Pairing the two together meant that it was one of the best low-key meals you could have. It was one of those recipes that never left you bloated, sluggish, or greasy after you ate it. Instead, you'd feel refreshed, lighter, and like you just spent the day relaxing in a spa. Plus, it was pretty cheap to make, you know? A perfect wintertime recipe. Remember how I just talked about the way one-pan meals were becoming really common? Enter Moroccan salmon sheet pan dinner. This was really a sign of the times and showed just how much people were progressing towards food that was easier to make. It took a lot of inspiration from Moroccan cuisine. You know what? Maybe that was obvious. Anyway, it also fuses those traditional flavors with sheet pan cooking. You might be wondering how this is a regular everyday recipe for your family though. Well, now it isn't, thanks to all the sky-high prices if you go out looking for a good cut of salmon. Back then though, salmon actually used to be fairly popular, enough that it was one of the most regular seafoods you could get. This had all the highlights of salmon and Moroccan cuisine. The light and flavorful meat was only amplified to new levels by the incredible spice blends that Moroccan recipes are so well known for. The roasted vegetables made this into the whole package. You had a full plate of food that crossed every item on a nutritional checklist while still tasting and looking like $1,000,000. Lexo vegetable stew is right out of the streets of Hungary and is honestly one of the best takes on a vegetable soup I've ever seen. You have the whole crew here: tomatoes, onions, paprika, sweet peppers, celery, and just about every other kind of vegetable you can imagine. I think we'd genuinely be superhuman if we ate this every day. It has a lot of similarities to dishes like shakshuka and Balkan stews, but the American adaptation is just a tad bit different, although surprisingly not too much. The biggest change that Americans made to the dish was honestly just using sausages, bacon, and other kinds of bits of meat to make it a bit more familiar. That and really thoroughly whisked eggs, although some die-hard Hungarians found it offensive. You would typically saute onions in lard and add the peppers and tomatoes, which were coated with paprika, into the soup. Then you just let it simmer until all of that wonderful stuff came together. While this obviously works wonderfully in the winters, it's also a great dish for the summers, where a lot of these vegetables end up being in season. If you really want to get ancient, exotic, and foreign, there's no better dish to talk about than Mujadara. This thing is pretty much as much of a relic as the Old Testament itself. It was one of the most popular, and honestly, one of the first lentil-based dishes to dominate the globe. It used a lot of simple things like rice and caramelized onions, but it was hailed in really high regard for how healthy it was on a budget. That led to it being seen as poor man's food, even in the United States. But its reputation changed in the 60s as an exotic vintage dish that a lot of people wanted to get into. After having recently found a new, deep appreciation for lentils and simple rice-based dishes, Americans couldn't wait to try more and more of what the world had to offer in this regard. The spice blend is really worth talking about here, since the use of cumin, coriander, cinnamon, and allspice isn't exactly the most conventional blend in American settings. A lot of people have forgotten this dish, but when Middle Eastern cuisine was still making its mark, it was one of the most talked about dishes you could try out. I think some places still do a pretty good Mujadara, and hey, if you've ever had one, I'd love to hear about your experience down in the comment below.
With just a little bit of the work, you can make stuff like baked egg cups and get 3 times the value for your money you otherwise would. After all, instead of those curries, stews, and pizzas, this just takes 3 whole ingredients. Everything you'll find on this list is built conveniently like that, and it tastes pretty good despite the minimal effort. Here you can expect a flavorful combination of eggs layered upon bacon, a combo I know you don't want to miss at the family table. How does something like that feel when you bake it with some cheese? What does the dish start to look like if you substitute one of those core 3 ingredients? That's the beauty of these dishes. They can be anything you'd like them to be. You just need to trust in your vision. Plus, every doctor tells you over and over that you need more eggs in your diet, and it's like, okay, I get it, but that doesn't make eating them any more fun. On the flip side, all the best coaches and trainers will tell you that enjoying what you eat is the most important part of keeping a diet. Personally, I'm starting to see where their rhetoric is coming from. This is definitely better than boiled eggs. Maybe you want to start your day off on a citrusy note and start it right too. You know, refreshing, clean, light, all that good jazz. It was known as an economy loaf, and it was something to really stop and stare at. No, seriously. Even with how smart people were with their food and their recipes in the Depression, this was probably the most convenient trick of them all. I bet this is how the person who first founded trains felt like. Anyway, that's a lot of glazing. Let's show some value now. Economy loaves were something that were inexplicably tied to World War II. It was so hard to make do with the little amounts of meat and rations people had in their homes. Plus, a lot of typical staples of daily American eating were just gone. Bread, for one, was something that definitely became more of a luxury than a guarantee. The US government saw the sheer value in economy loaves and pushed the idea even further. Suddenly, every government pamphlet and community cookbook had a DIY, easy-to-follow recipe that you could use. Plus, the ingredients were readily available. Makes sense that they'd promote these since it means most of the fresher stuff and the meat goes to the soldiers and war efforts. It definitely died down after the Depression, but for what it was, the economy loaf was, well, economical. Marshmallow fluff and sweet milk chocolate made moon pies a snack that people in Alabama just could not let go. Some people would spice theirs up with graham crackers, and the dark chocolate sauce was simply to die for. School kids, particularly teenagers, would always have a couple of packs of moon pies as they were bus ride comfort food. Were convenient snacks like the classic Vienna sausage. This comes all the way from Austria, but it's something that found a home in the daily lunches of so many Americans. The best part about this was that they were these pre-canned sausages that were fresh. They were frozen, so they were cold, but they could be eaten right out of the can. You didn't need to do anything with it, so the need for a microwave was completely non-existent. A lot of people rely on the defrost mode on theirs today to get their daily sausage fill, but Vietnamese sausages didn't need you to do anything but peel off the can. They were really easy for sausage-based dishes because you didn't have to do the hours-long process of making one from scratch. If you really wanted them hot, you could just get the stove going and you would have warm sausages perfectly fit for eating. No microwave or electricity needed. In that case, you need a morning tonic, and not just any old dusty recipe with sparkling water. You need the real thing. I'm talking lemon juice, honey, and ginger. It's a 3-ingredient pick-me-up, but it's got what you need, and it barely takes a minute to mix and shake, and voila, you have your tonic. As legitimate as anything you'd get out of a doctor, it's definitely something you gotta try at least once every now and then. The spiciness of the ginger gives it a kick, but the honey makes it roll into your taste buds with a sweet sensation, rounding it all off with a bright, citrusy afternote thanks to the lemon juice. It's good for your skin, it's refreshing, it costs barely anything, and it'll help your mornings go all the better. What's not to love here? I mean, if people are so willing to invest in Gatorade and other sports drinks that promise to replenish your electrolytes and provide up to thrice the hydration, why not put some stock in an actual healthy, all-natural tonic? Plus, it doesn't even feel like you're chugging some cheap drink. It actually feels and tastes good to sip. So you have a sweet tooth, but you have no patience for sticking with the delicate and sensitive process of baking. You need some easy recipes, and lucky for you, that's exactly what I'm peddling today. Beef barley soup is but a humble dish that comes right from tales of peasant wives making hearty breakfasts for their families. Sorry for sounding like a Lord of the Rings extra for a second. Really though, beef barley soup is as vintage as a recipe can get. Barley itself is one of the most ancient grains we have, not just in the States, but all across the world. Again, the idea of pairing it with beef is something we took from our European buddies that immigrated to Uncle Sam's greener pastures. When they weren't looking so green, and trust me, the 1930s and 40s were a long time, it was in everyone's mutual interest to play it smart. By that I mean there was a lot of inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for, but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get. Arizona would eventually borrow from Tex-Mex cuisine when chimichangas started becoming a regular sight at almost any Latin American restaurant. Fusion joints or roadside stalls, everyone would be selling some kind of chimichanga, which is a deep-fried burrito. Filled with green veggies and sauces, 6 out of 10 people in the street would pick one up on their way to work in the 70s. You might have come here expecting a meal that could make you completely filled. That's why I want you to meet the ground beef Wellington, which is a pretty nifty little rendition of a classic. Sausages don't really set the bar too high. They make for a pretty good snack, and in some cases, with a bit of creativity, even a pretty good meal. A main course would be something that could fill you up and have you walk away feeling like you're completely full. Now, back in the days before 1945, which is when the microwave was patented, making a puff pastry was a real pain in the neck. You could try, and a lot of people would, but it was something you needed a good reason for. Not at all something you'd rely on for a quick meal to wash away the hunger. That's where ground beef came in, and man, this was a national win for boomers. The thing is, it was a much cheaper and less labor-intensive way to make it, and before this, Wellington was mostly something expensive that only the rich got often. The best part was that it was something that just needed an oven, and the beef itself was something you could sear up in on your stove. You didn't need anything like a microwave or any kind of fancy pastry-making skills. After all, quick, tasty, and easy is the American way. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. For you, my dear effort-allergic viewer, I have sheet pan granolas, which are actually so much better for you than you'll even think to realize. Don't worry, I hate baking too, and I especially hate eating oatmeal as it is. But with this combination, I can kind of get the best of all three worlds. Rolled oats are used as the base of the granola before nuts and seeds are added, finally topping it all off with a honey or maple syrup glaze that really helps the oats stick together and seal that crunchiness in. End result? You get your protein, your sugar, and your dry fruits together all in one, and it barely takes a minute of baking. Get a crunchy and nice granola going for literally none of the effort or money. Isn't it the most American thing ever to work smart and not hard? The thing is, we could all use a lot more oats in our diet than we normally have right now. It's not just the protein thing. They have a host of other benefits. You know how much fiber is in these things? That also has the added benefit of keeping you full for longer. You got to invest in different ways of getting it in your system to keep things fresh. Continuing the protein train, if you find yourself keeping the workout part of things on lockdown but not being able to manage the diet part of things, you'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s, though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put 2 and 2 together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Salmon is such a widely caught fish in Alaska that salmon beef jerky should barely come as a surprise. Eggs, salmon beef jerky with a side of toast, was a cheap and common breakfast in diners and pubs in the state in the 70s. People would often have slices of beef jerky and use it in other dishes too, like casseroles or meatloafs. The whole need for convenient food without convenience tools like microwaves inspired things like wraps and deli food. One pretty popular and healthy choice was the avocado caprese wrap. It was kind of the boomer equivalent to a street-side shawarma back then. The whole thing was a 15-minute affair that used ingredients that were already prepared, and in places like California, most vendors really built up their speed over the long workdays. You had wraps available to you in as little as 5 minutes on a good day. And forget the microwave, this time you didn't even need any kind of stove. No cooking, heating, nothing to do with fire or knives involved. All you had to do was either assemble things yourself, which was just basic stuff like basil, cheese, and avocados, or wait for any of the many street sellers. And trust me, there wasn't a street in big cities that didn't have a designated wrap guy. I got a protein skillet with chickpeas and eggs with your name on it. This one makes use of 3 simple things: chickpeas, eggs, and spinach. And it's just as good as it sounds. This is like a natural-born steroid, the kind of thing to send your muscles into high gear immediately and get you meeting those protein requirements without any of the prep work. Don't feel like whipping up a fillet of grilled chicken with mashed potatoes and prepping your meals a night in advance? Don't feel like subjecting yourself to scoops of protein powder? Get ripped the natural way and have the benefit of a superfood all in one. This is one of the most refreshing skillets I could recommend. And honestly, it's one of the best post-workout meals too. Plus, expanding your horizons past just meat as a source of protein helps a lot. You get to take in different benefits of all kinds of foods while you also get what you originally wanted in your diet. Sometimes a cut of steak is what you need, but sometimes it wouldn't hurt to try some peas and beans. Now, when it comes to dieting, some people like whole wheat instead of the usual, and for them, I have another skillet-based meal. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and Squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of Bubble and Squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, Bubble and Squeak really emphasized the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? Deep frying things and vegetables would not stop at just that, because in Arkansas, fried pickles were the new mood of the week in the 70s. Just plain dill pickles that would be battered. Then deep fried, you could get baskets of these in food streets or in family gatherings as a side dish. Kind of something that hit its peak back in those ages, but it was pretty delicious. Chicago-style deep dish pizza isn't just a meal. It's a delicious entry point for northern kids into the world of cheese, sauces, and thick crusts. Unlike regular slices, deep dish pizza is baked in a tall pan, made to look more like a pie than a pizza. There are layers of cheese, meat, vegetables, and ketchup inside with sauce on top. It's an unusual choice that makes every bite delicious and satisfying. In the 70s, this hearty pizza became a Chicago icon, and it's often the choice for family nights, birthdays, or any reason to celebrate with some stretchy cheese. It's said that deep dish was invented to cater to busy Chicagoans who wanted a meal that could fill them up fast. And this pizza definitely did the trick. In the late 70s, kids from the North got used to eating thick, heavy pizza slices using forks and knives. Of course, if you don't want all the mess. For many people, Chicago-style pizza is more than just a meal. It is a glorious part of the local culture. A meal with weight, literally, and the beginning of a lifelong love affair with cheese and carbs. To this day, this is the perfect way to get a taste of the Windy City. So you might be surprised to hear Party Franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party Franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party Franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Before the age of nationwide Subway, we had things like the Philly-style Italian hoagie. Honestly, you could ask your dad or mom or even your grandparents about this, and they'd probably tell you everything you need to know, like a walking hoagie encyclopedia. It was just the thing to eat back in their day, and just like the dish Capri's wrap, let's just say it was the first thing in people's heads when their stomachs started growling. Depending on the preparation, you could be looking at 20 minutes. But if you were really in the rhythm of making this every day, and most people were, you'd be sitting with a sub in about 10. Nowadays, we rely on microwaves to melt our cheeses, warm our vegetables, defrost our meat, and so much more. Back then, some creative people in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, first had the idea to popularize the hoagie for many reasons. It was something that could fill you up, and it was easy to carry around and eat on the way to work. This is a textbook example of a working-class dish, and it needed absolutely no heat or cooking. Everything was either pre-made or just needed to be cut and assembled, so the time it would take was entirely dependent on how well you knew your way around a knife. Whole wheat no-knead skillet bread is exactly the sweet deal that it sounds like. Throw out everything you know about bread making because I'm about to actually blow your mind. You take whole wheat flour, yeast, and water, and that's it. You don't need to knead this bread at all. It just leaves on its own and rises perfectly, thanks to the whole wheat flour providing a nutty and reliable base for the bread. It takes just 3 things to make this loaf, but it's the perfect way to get bread on a lazy day when you don't feel like going all out or getting up and going to the nearest store just for bread. Also, sometimes you just don't have the ingredients to make a good loaf of bread, and in times like that, this is a way better alternative. This kind of bread started mostly in rural areas and in neighborhoods with a bit of a lower average income during economically stressful times, but it's because people coped in such innovative ways that we have lifesavers like this today. Let's add a lifesaver to your roster. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, Hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. If you're from Colorado and a baseball fan, you might remember Rocky Mountain oysters, which are a lot more questionable than they sound. Essentially, these are the testicles of bulls, which have been skinned, coated in flour and batter, and deep fried. As an appetizer, they were common at baseball games in the state, but it was a relatively local favorite that did not see much love in other places, even in the 70s. Pork and sauerkraut are the lucky foods of the New Year's meal in North America. It is especially popular among families of German or Eastern European descent. Pork and sauerkraut are believed to bring good luck in the new year. It is usually eaten on New Year's Day. With its rich and sour taste, it's easy to see why. This slow-cooked dish features delicious pork, usually grilled meat or sausage. It's paired with the pungent sauerkraut that brings out the spicy flavor of the pork. Kids grew up with the smell of sauerkraut simmering in the kitchen, which may be a little intense, but the end result is pure comfort food. To reduce the sourness, families used apples, potatoes, and even a little brown sugar, making it palatable for young taste buds. Northern kids learned to love it, or at least they learned to accept it, especially when served with mashed potatoes or dumplings. In the late 70s, pork and sauerkraut was more than just food. It was a beloved New Year's tradition, a plate full of history. And there it was, an opportunity to start the year with a full stomach and high hopes. For those who grew up in the North, pork and sauerkraut are reminders of family, tradition, and good fortune. In a similar way, but also on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have no Noodle Pad Thai, and I can already hear the disgruntled sighs from the traditionalists among you guys, but hear me out. It's not as blasphemous as you'd think. I know traditionally, you get Pad Thai with enough noodles to satisfy all your cravings, but this time, it relies entirely on fresh produce. See, the reason for that was that the landscape of America's eating habits was entirely different from what we're used to. Fast food hadn't taken off yet, McDonald's didn't have every minor in a chokehold, and Wendy's wasn't the go-to takeout for couples spending a lazy Saturday together. People were still eating zucchini and carrots and being health-conscious. Of course, that didn't mean they'd be healthy in a non-American way. Efficiency was still the name of the game, and that's why this no noodle pad Thai recipe took off as well as it did. You can have a bowl of lovely pad Thai with all the flavors you're used to expecting in under 10-20 minutes on a gas flame or a stovetop. If you had some leftovers from the night before, you could just warm it up over a stovetop. It was a pretty refreshing way to go about your lunch. A pizza roll can be the difference between sleep for dinner and a good night's rest with nice dreams and a full stomach, and I always want the second for you. I still know that pizza rolls aren't really the most reliable thing to have at late hours of the night, though, unless you just happen to regularly keep stocks of them, in which case, kudos to your dedication. For the more spontaneous viewer that makes their week as it goes along like I do, this 3-ingredient recipe for pizza rolls is a total lifesaver. You just need a simple dough, whether it's homemade or store-bought, any kind of your favorite cheese and a tomato sauce, and voila, you have yourself a pizza ready to go. It's a pretty simple one, but with just a bit of baking and good skills with rolling, you'll have pocket pizza wherever you go. Also, it doubles as the perfect snack to offer someone when they're hungry. You always want to be that guy who's quick with a bite to eat. You get places in life faster that way. Similarly, sometimes you need to cut back on the junk and eat a little bit on the greener side of things. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. Chipped hummus on toast, also known as SOS, which stands for Same Old Stuff, is a classic Northern comfort food from the 1970s. This dish is basically just warm toast and dry beef, thinly sliced, and cooked in a white cream sauce, dressed on top. Simple but full of flavor, it was popular in cafeterias both at home and at school. Northern boys saw it as both a snack and a mystery. Why do some simple things taste so good? Chipped cream makes a quick breakfast or dinner, especially when time and ingredients are limited. This dish has its roots in military cuisine where it became a staple due to its low cost and high energy boost. Some families add peas or parsley to add some color, but for the most part, it maintains a straightforward flavor. Northern children learned to associate the rich, savory flavor of crispy potato chips with comforting breakfasts and home-cooked meals. In the late 70s, chipped beef and hummus on toast were more than just a meal. It was a satisfying and comforting slice of Americana, a dish that could always satisfy, and proof that the best recipes don't have to be fancy. For many, it remains a reminder of simpler times and a classic favorite. Continuing on the same healthy note, you might have noticed that a lot of people tend to prefer the likes of beans and lentils over double-fried patties with extra cheese. Things like avocado and chickpea tacos were such a hit in the pre-microwave era, but they didn't start being a daily meal until pre-cooked chickpeas and canned ones came around. For about 25 cents a piece, you no longer had to spend hours on the stovetop soaking and cooking chickpeas, and the avocado was again just a matter of how fast you could be with a knife. The tortillas might have been cooked on a griddle or skillet, but all you really needed was a mortar to grind the chickpeas in. All in all, it was a pretty no-fuss manual process that didn't take much out of you or your wallet and left you fuller and healthier. I kind of make it sound like people were actively choosing to be healthy in some nationwide movement surrounding greener eating, but it wasn't often like that. You had your condensed soup to get through Monday and your bread and legumes, molasses, and other typical foods. That was because a lot of things were getting expensive thanks to the terrible conditions of the economy at the time, and things like soup exploded in popularity as a result. Didn't help that boomers kind of went wild with the entire starting a family thing. It was pretty common for homes to consist of at least 4 to 5 people. Condensed soup was pretty much a war period classic that was something you'd find in both urban and rural areas. Pop open some Campbell's tomato soup that just needed a bit of water and heat, and voila, you were enjoying the best modernity had to offer, a pre-cooked soup. The Italian beef sandwich is a juicy, messy northern dish that kids in the 70s couldn't get enough of. This delicious sandwich starts with thinly sliced beef, slowly cooked in a spicy broth until melt-in-your-mouth soft. The beef is then placed on a sturdy Italian roll. It is often garnished with sweet chili peppers or spicy chili peppers for added deliciousness. It is then dipped, or baptized, in the spicy broth again. In northern cities like Chicago, Italian beef is more than just a meal. It's an event, with families braving messy fingers and lots of napkins to dig into this dripping masterpiece. The sandwich's origins go back to Italian immigrants who stretched meat for large gatherings, making it an inexpensive yet delicious option. Northern kids learned quickly that an Italian beef sandwich wasn't something to eat neatly. The mess is part of the experience. In the late 70s, Italian beef sandwiches were a cultural staple in northern homes, a food that combines both taste and feeling. For those who grew up with it, Italian beef is more than just a sandwich. It's a beloved tradition, a taste of the North's Italian roots, and an unbeatable craving. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say?
The last stop we will be visiting on our list is sautéed cabbage and peppers. This combines the new interest Americans had in vegetables, which was so prominent throughout the 60s, along with some cooking techniques that became more and more mainstream, like sautéing. Peppers were always a big thing in the South, and places where Cajun, Creole, and Mexican cooking were common. Neighborhoods like that always had a big emphasis on spicy foods after all. They didn't hit the mainstream until dishes like this started making rounds from rural areas all the way to the suburbs in Los Angeles and the hills, though. This was one of the best ways to get some greens into your diet while also being on a budget. It also became really common in places with a culture of farming and relying on homegrown ingredients. Lots of bell peppers were used, but oddly enough, the spices were kept a little low. Then again, I guess we've never been a country known for our impressive spice tolerances. I still think this is a bit of an odd mix, though. What's your take on it? Would you ever try cabbage and peppers together? Or do you need some kind of lean meat to go along with it? Let me know what your favorite from the entire list was down below. Aren't you glad we brought back these iconic dishes from the 60s? Comment down below which was your favorite, and don't forget to like and subscribe.